Welcome to History Lost in Time, from one enthusiast to others. And welcome to episode 18. In this episode, I will talk about radio broadcasting in the Third Reich during the war with the focus on Germany itself. This means I will not talk about radio broadcasting in the occupied territories or about foreign German language broadcasts. This will come in future episodes. Why this topic today? The material I have regarding radio broadcasting history is so vast that I have to split it this way. Otherwise, an episode regarding the war could probably be 50 to 60 minutes long. That's just too much effort to put into a single episode. Political background and commentary. I don't pursue a political agenda with this episode, I am just interested in this topic in general. Radio broadcasting during the war is rarely the focus of documentaries or analysis. Sure, in documentaries or war movies there's always a Volksempfänger somewhere in the background, but usually the focus is on written propaganda, or the Wochenschau newsreels in the cinemas. However, the radio was much closer to the life of people, and especially during the second half of the war, radio accompanied people very closely, but that's usually just mentioned in passing. Going to the cinema might have been more impressive, but while people probably only did this a few times a month, the radio was running at home every day. The sources. My sources are a CD box and 3 books. Radio unterm Hakenkreuz von 1933 bis 45, die Geschichte des Rundfunks in Deutschland. Translation: Radio Under the Swastika from 1933 to 1945, The History of Radio Broadcasting in Germany. Published by Hans Sarkowitsch, Production Hessischer Rundfunk 2004. This CD package of the Hessia Broadcasting Corporation provides a very interesting and broad overview to the listener and also includes a lot of snippets of broadcasts from the era. Rundfunk in Deutschland, herausgegeben von Hans Bausch, Band 2, Ansgar Diller, Rundfunkpolitik im Dritten Reich. Translation: Radio Broadcasting in Germany, published by Hans Bausch, Volume 2 by Ansgar Diller, Radio Broadcasting Politics in the Third Reich, published by Deutscher Taschenbuchverlag, München, 1980. Probably the standard work when it comes to radio broadcasting in this era. Zuhören und gehört werden 1. Radio im Nationalsozialismus, zwischen Lenkung und Ablenkung. Translation: Listening and being listened to 1. Radio during National Socialism, from controlling to distracting. Published by Inge Marsolek and Adelheid von Saldern. Published by Edition Discord, Tübingen, 1998. This book provides insights into areas that are not covered by the Radio Politics book. Josef Goebbels Tagebücher, Translation Diaries, published by Ralf Georg Reuth, Verlag Piper, München, 1992. As Goebbels was chief propagandist in the Third Reich, I thought it would be important to get his input as well. World War II in Europe started on September 1st, 1939, with the salvos of the old battleship Schleswig-Holstein targeting the Westerplatte near Danzig. Just FYI, this ship is often called a ship of the line, but I'll talk more about that in a future Navy episode. The regional radio station in Danzig was the first to report the fighting. All Reich radio stations brought special reports at 6, 7, 8 and 10 o'clock that day. So when Hitler held his speech at the Reichstag on September 1st, the German population was already informed. In this speech, he said the famous words, "Since 5:45 this morning we are shooting back." Hitler was talking about previous border violations by Poland in order to portray the invasion as a defensive war. The fact that these border violations, like for instance the attack on the Gleiwitz radio station, were false flag attacks executed by the SD, or completely fictional, was obviously not mentioned by him. Thanks to the treaty with the Soviet Union, Hitler had the support that he needed for this invasion. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union joined the campaign to occupy Poland. Thanks to the radio, the German people were as close to the front lines as never before. During World War I, the civilian population relied on newspapers, but now radio stations supplied the population with news, special reports, and daily frontline updates. With some delay, people were also able to watch newsreels from the front lines in the cinemas. But radio reports also tried to provide a dynamic and vivid impression of the fighting by adding combat sounds like artillery fire, machine gun fire, and explosions. However, September 1939 also brought new restrictions to German radio owners. Only a few days after the outbreak of the war, listening to foreign radio stations was finally banned. Minister of Propaganda Goebbels insisted, and he found an ally in Rudolf Hess. Minister of Justice Gürtner opposed this idea. He stated that such a ban would create denunciations, which it did, and it would seem like a vote of no confidence regarding the German population and the German news service. However, Hitler sided with Goebbels, and the ban was passed. The population was informed via news and skits in ads. People that ignored the ban could be punished with prison. Goebbels pushed for deterrent judgment from time to time, and when that happened, people were sentenced to up to 8 years in prison. Others were sent to concentration camps without any trial. Starting in 1941, people were also sentenced to death. In 1942 alone, about 1,000 people were convicted as broadcast criminals, and people weren't just convicted for listening themselves. People could also get convicted if they were informed about foreign radio broadcasts in conversations by those that had actually listened to them. Many Nazi officials tried to get exemptions from this law. In some cases, these exemptions actually had valid reasons, for instance for people in the Wehrmacht, the Foreign Affairs Office, or the Ministry of Propaganda. But Gauleiter and low-ranking officials also tried to get exemptions for sometimes ridiculous reasons. However, the number of granted exemptions was very low and was reduced over time. Illegal listening to foreign radio stations was actually very widespread. When the war dragged on, the German people increasingly used Allied radio broadcasts to get information about certain topics. One of the reasons for that was the tendency of German news services for whitewashing. That way they had lost credibility. My own grandfather told me how he sat down with his older brother, at the time already an active soldier at the Eastern Front, to listen to a British radio station targeting soldiers. Soldiers in particular didn't care much about the ban, as they preferred the music selection of the Allied radio stations, and the Wehrmacht didn't cooperate with the Ministry of Propaganda on this topic. In order to prevent German soldiers from listening to Allied radio, Goebbels had to relax his restrictive policy regarding music. There was a popular saying among the Germans regarding illegally listening to foreign radio broadcasts. 3 little complainers were listening to the radio. One of them tuned in England, then left were just 2. Jews were hit even harder. They were completely banned from owning radios after September 20, 1939. This ban also applied to people of mixed blood and Germans living in Jewish households. The confiscated radios were transferred mostly to the Wehrmacht. During the campaigns of 1939-1940, there were lots of special reports and victory reports on the radio. However, the remaining program was similar to pre-war programming. The Ministry of Propaganda had to transfer a lot of people from the radio services to the Wehrmacht propaganda companies, however. All reports from the front lines and about the military were done by the Wehrmacht itself, and the propaganda ministry didn't have much say when it came to that, much to the dismay of Goebbels. The Wehrmacht invested a lot of resources into these propaganda companies. In 1939, about 750 people worked there. By 1943, that number had increased to 5,000. The lack of personnel at the radio stations led to a unification of the entire radio program. Starting on June 9, 1940, all German regional radio stations broadcast the exact same program, which was called Großdeutscher Rundfunk, or Greater German Broadcasting. Another reason for this was the demand of the Wehrmacht to shut down radio stations when enemy bombers were approaching. If the stations remained active, the bombers could use them for navigation purposes. But thanks to the Großdeutscher Rundfunk, listeners could switch to other regional stations when their own was shut down and still continue listening to the same program. However, this shutting down and turning back on of the stations remained controversial. The rulings and decisions changed constantly. The Wehrmacht insisted on a general ban on radio broadcasts during the night. However, the Ministry of Propaganda wanted to provide good programming for moral support even and especially to people sitting in air raid shelters. On top of that, the radio stations provided the population with information about incoming enemy bombers, which was very vital. The attempt to switch from wireless transmission to wire transmission using the telephone lines was only done to a small degree. In the end, the stations remained active, but the times when they were allowed to send changed constantly, and there was always the possibility of an emergency shutdown at any time. When people were forced to switch to other regional stations, reception quality could suffer. In 1942, the regional medium-wave stations and the national long-wave station split up a bit. While the medium-wave stations focused more on entertainment, the long-wave station focused on the more serious topics. The unified programming was dominated by Wehrmacht reports, special reports, air raid reports, frontline updates, political commentary, speeches, and political rallies. But light entertainment music remained the dominating part of the program, because the focus was still relaxation and distraction. The most popular and largest radio show was the Wunschkonzert, the request concert for the Wehrmacht. It was produced in front of a live audience and was the most successful entertainment show of the Third Reich. It ran from 1939 to 42 and started at 2 times a week, which was later reduced to 1 time a week. The time slot was 17 to 20 o'clock. About half of all radio owners listened to it. Thousands of letters per week reached the production office, which proved how popular the show was. Final editing was done by Goebbels personally in order to ensure the highest possible degree of control over the show. Stars from the radio, the cinema, and the stage were regularly performing. When the war situation worsened in 1942, the show was cancelled since it was deemed to no longer be appropriate. Working for the radio services started to become a lot harder from 1941 onward, as victory reports became more rare and reports about defeats increased. The radio services were quite challenged with events like the sinking of the Bismarck, the flight of Rudolf Hess to Scotland, and the war against the Soviet Union. The large successful battles of July 1941 resulted in a lot of special reports boasting about large victories. These reports were started with the new Russia fanfare. Comments that the war in the East was as good as won and that the Soviet Union was broken were made a lot. Goebbels feared that this would come back to haunt the radio services and decrease their credibility. But as said before, he was no longer in total control over what was being broadcast. When the Soviet resistance did not end and the Wehrmacht was surprised by the Soviet counteroffensive in the winter of 1941-42, the German population was fairly disillusioned. The propaganda focused more and more on Rommel in North Africa, because up to late 1942, things looked rather good there. Goebbels did his best to indoctrinate the Germans with a pre-developed opinion on everything and to define a very narrow corridor of opinions. In his diary, he wrote on July 12, 1941, page 1633, "How good it is that the German people don't find out all this. They get their opinion ready-made. In war, this is the only form of news and propaganda policy that can lead to success." This clearly shows that a mix of manipulation and concealment dominated radio broadcasting in Germany since 1941. In 1939 and 40, the radio services could still win by using the truth, but now it had to rely on manipulation. Retreats were now called planned withdrawals or frontline straightening, and whenever the enemy made some gains, it was always stressed that these successes came at a hefty and bloody price. Probably the best-known song of the time is Lili Marleen, sung by Lale Andersen. Goebbels hated this sentimental song and tried to ban it repeatedly. He despised the singer once it became known that she wrote letters to Jewish emigrants. However, the song was too popular to be banned, so Goebbels was forced to keep sending it. Starting in August 1941, it was broadcast daily, shortly before 2200 hours, by the soldier radio station Belgrade. Allied soldiers also liked the song, and as Lala Andersen was very popular and well known, nothing could be done against her. This would now be a good moment to play this song. Actually, this episode would benefit from playing a lot of original recordings from that time, but you know how it is. I could play you a 5,000-year-old song from ancient Egypt, and someone would come up and claim licensing rights for it. Therefore, my policy remains: no songs, no snippets, and I will read the news reports myself. Sorry. During the war, a man named Hans Fritzsche became increasingly important and powerful within the Ministry of Propaganda. Goebbels liked him a lot because he had a talent to organize things. In 1942, he became head of the radio department within the Ministry of Propaganda, and he was also responsible for all political and propagandistic content on the radio. However, his popularity was based upon the fact that he was the speaker for political commentary on the radio. The words "Es sprach Hans Fritzsche," meaning Hans Fritzsche was speaking, were basically known by anyone. Fritzsche expanded his influence even towards entertainment content. His popularity was the reason that the Soviets put him on trial at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal as a sort of replacement for Goebbels. However, he was found not guilty there. He was finally convicted during the denazification trials later, but more about that in a future episode. From 1939 to 43, the radio services broadcast these so-called ring shows at Christmas. During these shows, many German military outposts called in. The show appeared to be live, but it relied on pre-recordings. However, the effect on the population was enormous. During the largest show in 1942, German outposts called in from the Arctic Ocean, Stalingrad, although it's more likely that Kharkov called in, Lapland, the south of France, several outposts in the Mediterranean and the Eastern Front, the Atlantic coast, the Channel coast, the Caucasus, Crete, and Crimea. According to estimates, up to 100 million listeners heard the show, and the effect was enormous. However, a short while later, on February 3, 1943, the population was shocked when it heard about the end of the Stalingrad drama. I will now read the text that was broadcast by the radio stations back then. From the Führer's headquarters, February 3, 1943, the Wehrmacht High Command announces: the battle for Stalingrad is over. True to its oath of allegiance until its last breath, the Sixth Army, under the exemplary leadership of Field Marshal Paulus, succumbed to the enemy's superior strength and unfavorable conditions. Its fate is shared by an anti-aircraft division of the German Air Force, 2 Romanian divisions, and a Croatian regiment, which, in loyal brotherhood in arms with their comrades of the German army, did their duty to the utmost. It is not yet time to describe the course of the operations that led to this development, but one thing can already be said today: the army's sacrifice was not in vain. As a bulwark of the historic European mission, it held back the onslaught of 6 Soviet armies for many weeks. Completely surrounded by the enemy, it held strong enemy forces tied down for further weeks of the most difficult struggle and the harshest deprivation. It thus gave the German command the time and opportunity to take countermeasures, the implementation of which would determine the fate of the entire Eastern Front. Faced with this task, the Sixth Army ultimately persevered when, as the encirclement and the operations progressed, the Luftwaffe, despite extreme efforts and heavy losses, was unable to ensure adequate air support, and the possibility of relief dwindled more, and finally completely. The surrender, twice demanded by the enemy, was proudly rejected. Under the swastika flag hoisted prominently on the highest ruins of Stalingrad, the final battle took place. Generals, officers, NCOs, and soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder until the last bullet. They died so that Germany could live. Their example will have an impact until the distant future, despite all false Bolshevik propaganda. The divisions of the Sixth Army, however, are already in the process of reforming. Goebbels wrote in his diary on the next day, page 1890, his own thoughts regarding this report. We are now forced to announce the abandonment of Stalingrad to the German people. This is a very bitter but necessary decision. We will broadcast the news as a special report on the radio news service around 4 p.m. and announce it with appropriate heroic ceremony. The news about the collapse at Stalingrad was considered by the German population as a dramatic turning point of the war, according to reports from the security service of the SS, the SD. As a reaction to that, Goebbels held his Total War speech on February 18, 1943. Total War had dramatic effects on the cultural life in Germany. Publishers, museums, theaters, newspapers, almost everything was shut down. There were no more cultural events. Only the radio and the cinema were unaffected. Officials within the radio services had longer and longer meetings in which they tried to develop ways to do something helpful and effective. The soundtrack to this was provided by Sarah Leander and her almost conjuring song called I Know Someday There Will Be a Miracle. When there were some good news among the many bad news, for instance when Benito Mussolini was liberated by German troops, this was talked about very broadly and bombastically. However, whether that could really make people forget about the bad news, like abandoning North Africa, Sicily, or when Italy switched sides. From 1942 onward, the German population relied a lot on the air raid warnings. During that year, the British bomber offensive intensified to new dramatic levels. Firestorms and 1,000 bomber attacks wiped out one German city after another. The number of dead, injured, and homeless people rose dramatically. In 1943, the American bomber offensive came on top of that. The Germans no longer shut off their radios. They ran constantly so people could always hear air raid warnings. In the mornings, the radio stations mentioned the time more often than before in order to give some orientation to the tired population. This was considered to be rather helpful. In the Listening and Being Listened to book, 2 women are quoted with their memories on the bomber war and the radio broadcasting services. The first quote is from pages 349-350. Konrad Paula 8. I remember that very vividly. That was the signal for the approach of enemy bomber squadrons toward Herne. When they were announced on the radio, we knew we had to go into the bunker. The second quote is from further down, on page 350. We received detailed radio updates from a station in Nuremberg about the approaching enemy bombers. The news announcer had earned the nickname Valerian during the war, for he had a wonderfully soothing voice, and with equally soothing words he announced the positions of the enemy units that had just crossed the German border. Even when the planes turned in our direction and there was imminent danger, his tone of voice never changed. You have to say, he had a steady nerve. The grid squares, like for instance Konrad Paula 8, were well known by the population after a short while. With the help of self-made maps and school atlases, people quickly knew where the bombers were and if they were in danger. The longer the war dragged on, the more difficult it became to get spare parts like vacuum tubes or batteries for the radios. More and more people were forced to share radios. People also criticized the radio programming for being too uniform and repetitive. In some cases, inappropriate songs were played after bad news from the Eastern Front, for example songs called "That's How We Are, We Don't Care About Worries" or "The World Won't End Because of This." In Essen, the local population had to listen to the song "I'll Dance With You Into Heaven" after an air raid. However, the Ministry of Propaganda remained true to its entertain and amuse course and ignored criticism. The last year of the war caused the German radio services to collapse step by step. However, the radio services were also one of the last stable pillars of the Hitler regime. When the Allies landed in Normandy, the German news service claimed that the Allies were received by well-prepared German troops. During the assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20, 1944, it was the Hitler speech that finished off the coup attempt. On the evening of July 20th, the news services had broadcast that Hitler had survived and that already severely damaged Stauffenberg's efforts in Berlin. But when Hitler himself spoke on July 21st, at 1 o'clock in the morning, his last effort collapsed. Before that, Stauffenberg and his team had tried to paint these reports as fake news, obviously not using this term, but when Hitler spoke himself, they couldn't use this argument anymore. Today, one would then claim that this was an AI-generated voice. Today, nobody believes anything anymore, except from sources that one likes. Everything else is fake news, fake planet, fake universe, fake reality. But I digress. In his speech, Hitler addressed all Germans and he even gave orders. I will now quote from this speech. I therefore order at this moment, first, that no civilian authority shall accept any order from any agency arrogated to them by these usurpers. Second, that no military authority, no troop commander, no soldier shall obey any order given by these usurpers. On the contrary, everyone is obligated to either immediately arrest the transmitter or giver of such an order, or, if they resist, to immediately kill them. Every German, no matter who he may be, has the duty to confront these elements ruthlessly, either immediately arresting them or, if they should offer any resistance, to kill them without further ado. Hitler bypassed the usual channels, which were jammed by the Stauffenberg team, and used the radio services to directly address all civil servants, soldiers, and civilians. A short time after that, the radio services broadcast an interview with Otto Ernst Rehmer, who played a key role in suppressing this uprising. In autumn 1944, the radio services tried to remobilize the Germans with reports about the V-weapon attacks on England. Additionally, the Soviet forces were depicted as being extremely brutal. The Germans were urged to resist them with all force they could muster. For once, exaggeration wasn't required here. Germans and Soviets had both fought with extreme brutality, sparing nobody. Also in autumn 1944, the number of operational radio stations started to drop. They were lost either due to bomb damage or because the Allies had conquered them. The Reichssender Luxembourg was taken by US forces in fairly decent condition and was able to resume broadcasting after a few weeks. An Austrian emigrant set up broadcasting for the Allies there. The content included special reports from Aachen, which was conquered in October 1944. The collapse of the electrical grid, increasing levels of destruction, and people fleeing from the advancing Allied armies meant that the number of radio listeners was dropping. However, Goebbels and his ministry continued working and produced radio content until shortly before the end of the war. On January 30, 1945, Hitler spoke for the last time on the radio. Goebbels had asked him for a long time to speak again, since his speeches usually had an enormous effect on the German population, even though that effect had diminished over time. However, Hitler resisted Goebbels because he wanted to present some success to the Germans. After the Battle of the Bulge was lost, he had no choice, however. In this final speech, he started with a historical review of German history starting in 1918. He blamed Jewish Bolshevik forces with the collapse of 1918. He blamed the bourgeoisie with being incapable of resisting that. After that, he held a positive review of the time since 1933, presented his actions as being without alternative, and asked for the Germans to keep resisting. In the end, all he had to offer were slogans of perseverance, historical reviews, and backdrops of fear. His speech had little effect. In late April 1945, Goebbels wanted to send Fritzsche to Hamburg so that he could continue broadcasting propaganda from there. However, Fritzsche remained in Berlin. In the last days of the war, Goebbels tried to set up the Werwolf movement, sort of like a German partisan movement. For that, he provided the Werwolf groups with their own radio transmitter. However, the Werwolf movement was a failure. It didn't do much, its transmitter was silent most of the time, and probably only heard by very few people. The wartime program of the Greater German Broadcasting continued to be produced in Berlin until the very end. When the Berlin radio stations, both the medium wave and the long wave station, were no longer operational, which happened on April 19th and 24th, a data cable that crisscrossed the front lines was used to send the content to the Hamburg radio station. This cable was finally destroyed on April 29th. On April 28th, the Munich radio station reported that it had been taken over by the Bavarian Freedom Action and that this team was now taking over the government. This uprising was crushed within 12 hours. However, just one day later, the Munich station was broadcasting jazz, as it had been taken over by the Americans. On May 1st, 1945, only the stations in Hamburg and Flensburg were still operational. The Hamburg station transmitted this report on May 1st, 1945. It is reported from the Führer's headquarters that our Führer Adolf Hitler fell this afternoon in his command post in the Reichschancellery, fighting for Germany until his last breath against Bolshevism. On April 30th, the Führer appointed Grand Admiral Dönitz as his successor. The fact that Hitler committed suicide was omitted. In his speech following directly after this announcement, Admiral Dönitz called upon all Germans to remain at their posts and to keep doing their duty. Regarding his own goals, he said the following: "Conscious of my responsibility, I assume the leadership of the German people in this fateful hour. My first task is to save the German people from annihilation by the advancing Bolshevik enemy. Only for this goal will the military struggle continue. As far and as long as the achievement of this goal is hindered by the British and Americans, we will have to continue to defend ourselves and fight against them." In the following days, Dönitz, Minister of Armaments Speer, the new Minister of Foreign Affairs Schwerin von Krosigk, and the Gauleiter of Hamburg Karl Kaufmann held speeches on the radio. On May 3rd, the Hamburg station shut down after it was occupied by the British. Following the unconditional surrender, the Flensburg secondary station was the only one left to broadcast the following report. 8:30 p.m. Reichssender Flensburg and its affiliated stations. Today we are bringing you the last Wehrmacht report of this war. From the Grand Admiral's headquarters, May 9th, 1945. The High Command of the Wehrmacht announces: in East Prussia, German divisions bravely defended the mouth of the Vistula and the western part of the Vistula Spit to the very end yesterday, with the 7th Infantry Division particularly distinguishing itself. The Commander-in-Chief, General of Panzer Troops von Saucken, was awarded the diamonds with oak leaves and swords to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in recognition of his soldiers' exemplary conduct. As a forward bulwark, our armies in Kurland, under the proven command of Colonel General Hilpert, held down superior Soviet infantry and armored units for months and earned lasting glory in 6 major battles. They refused any premature surrender. Far from home, the defenders of the Atlantic bases, our troops in Norway, and the garrisons of the Aegean Islands, in obedience and discipline, upheld the honor of the German soldier. Since midnight, the guns have been silent on all fronts. By order of the Grand Admiral, the Wehrmacht has ceased the fight, which had become hopeless. This brings to an end the almost 6-year heroic struggle. It has brought us great victories, but also heavy defeats. In the end, the German Wehrmacht was honorably defeated by overwhelming odds. We have published the text of the last Wehrmacht report of this war. A radio silence of 3 minutes will be in effect. On May 10th, the Flensburg radio station was taken over by the British, but was still allowed to keep broadcasting reports from the Dönitz government. However, these reports were censored by the British. On May 13th, the station was finally shut down. The Dönitz government was, for all intents and purposes, isolated from the rest of the country. Due to the collapse of all structures, it had been unable to do anything anyway, though. Its last effective action was distributing the news about the unconditional surrender and to order a complete ceasefire. However, it took several days for the fighting to completely end, especially in Bohemia and Yugoslavia. The end of the Flensburg radio station marked the end of 22 years of uninterrupted German radio broadcasting. The Allies banned the Germans from producing and broadcasting radio content. However, as we all know, the Western Allies and the Soviet Union had differing ideas on how to manage Germany. Therefore, new radio services managed by the Communist Party were set up in Eastern Germany, while public broadcasters on a regional level were set up in Western Germany. But more about that in future episodes. Finishing words. During the war, the radio services were a constant companion of the population. At first, the radio was a source of victory reports, but in the end it turned into a source of defeat reports and air raid warnings. The nature of propaganda caused the German news service to lose credibility, which caused the Germans to increasingly tune into foreign radio stations. The radio services helped Hitler regain control after the July 20th assassination attempt one last time, and they also distributed the lie about him falling in combat on May 1st, 1945. However, on May 9th, 1945, the Greater German broadcasting was finally finished. A whitewashed report about the surrender was the last thing it could do. In theory, the Flensburg radio station could be heard in all of Germany, but it is impossible to say how many people actually heard this report live. Considering the widespread destruction and the collapse of the infrastructure, it couldn't have been a lot. Thank you for your interest.